The wind carried the scent of dust and wild sage as the stagecoach rolled across the sun-baked road toward Redemption Creek, Colorado. The land stretched endlessly, gold and silver and shadow, and the mountains in the distance shimmered like they guarded the secrets of 1,000 souls who had passed through. Inside the coach, Violet Harrington clutched a worn leather satchel to her chest, her fingers trembling against the cracked handle. Every creak of the wheels, every jolt on the uneven trail echoed like the heartbeat of the past she had tried so hard to bury. 8 years had passed since she fled this place. 8 years since her name had been whispered in shame through every doorway and down every alley of the little town that once called her its jewel. Violet Rose Harrington, the banker's daughter who had disappeared one night after her father's ruin and never returned. The scandal had burned her world to ash, leaving behind a heart too raw to mend, and a love she thought she'd never dare remember. Yet here she was, at 25, returning to the very town that had broken her, the bonnet shading her face, the sunlight trembling on the edge of her lashes, like fear waiting to fall. As the driver called out that Redemption Creek was just ahead, Violet pressed her gloved hand to the window. The horizon blurred with emotion. She told herself she was coming back as someone new, Miss Harrington, the teacher from St. Louis, a respectable woman with letters of recommendation, with dignity and composure, and years of distance between her and the girl who once loved too deeply. But her heart whispered the truth she didn't want to face. She was still the girl who had left a piece of herself behind. The town appeared like a mirage, familiar and foreign at once. The general store with its striped awning, the silver-dollar saloon glinting in the sun, the white church standing patient and unchanged, it all felt like stepping into a memory she hadn't earned the right to revisit. She drew a long breath as the coach rattled to a stop. "Redemption Creek, ma'am," the driver announced. When Violet stepped down, the ground beneath her boots felt alive, almost breathing, as though the town itself was aware she'd returned. The sound of hammering came from the blacksmith's forge, children's laughter drifted from somewhere near the bakery, and the faint melody of a piano spilled out from the saloon, a tune of longing, of something half-remembered. The sunlight painted everything in a haze of gold, so soft it almost seemed forgiving. She had told herself she would walk quickly to Mrs. Wilkins' boarding house, keep her head down, avoid conversation. But memory had a cruel way of turning every corner into a ghost. The window of her father's old bank still gleamed, though the sign now bore a different name. 1,000 fragments of her old life flashed in her mind, the scent of ink and money, her mother's soft laughter at the piano, the weight of her father's hand on her shoulder before everything fell apart. Violet forced herself to keep walking. Redemption, she reminded herself, was not a place you arrived at. It was something you carried. She had almost reached the boarding house when a voice, low and steady, brushed the air behind her. "Miss, you dropped this." She froze. The sound of those words, the warmth of that tone, reached into the marrow of her bones. Slowly, as if her body knew before her mind dared to, she turned. He stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, the sun catching the silver star on his vest. His eyes, clear, familiar, devastating, met hers, and in that instant the years between them vanished. Sheriff Elijah Montgomery. Once the ranch hand who had stolen her heart under the apple trees, now the lawman who ruled the streets, she feared to walk again. He held out a small handkerchief, embroidered with violets. Her grandmother's gift. She hadn't even realized it had slipped from her grasp. For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. "Thank you, Sheriff," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look up. She couldn't. But she felt the moment he recognized her, the subtle stillness that swept through him, the quiet disbelief that lingered in the air. "Do I know you?" he asked softly. Her pulse roared in her ears. She wanted to lie, to vanish, to say no and walk away. "I don't believe so, sir. I'm the new school teacher." When she finally lifted her eyes, time stopped. There it was, the flicker of recognition, the impossible tenderness of a smile that said he'd known her all along. "Welcome to Redemption Creek," he murmured. "Or should I say, welcome back, Violet Rose." Her breath caught. No one had spoken her full name since she'd left. It was as though the past itself had reached out and called her home. She wanted to run, to cry, to laugh, but instead she nodded politely and whispered, "Mrs. Wilkins is expecting me." He tipped his hat, his gaze steady and kind. "Then I'll see you at the town meeting tomorrow, Miss Harrington." As she walked away, her heart was no longer steady. The ground seemed to sway beneath her feet. He had smiled at her, not with anger, not with judgment, but with something achingly gentle, something like forgiveness. That night, in her small upstairs room, she opened her journal by lamplight. The words came trembling from her pen. "I have returned to the place that both made and broke me. The air tastes the same, the sky feels the same, but I am not the girl who left. And yet he looked at me as if I never went away. How can he smile at me after everything my father did? How can someone still see love where I only see ruin?" Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods. The town slept, unaware that one of its lost daughters had come home. The next day, the schoolhouse awaited her, a small wooden building at the end of Main Street with sunlight slanting through dusty windows. She touched the chalkboard gently, tracing its surface as if it could erase the ache inside her. The children would come soon. They would see her as Miss Harrington, not as the fallen banker's daughter. Maybe teaching would save her. Maybe it would let her forget. But as she arranged her books and straightened the rows of benches, her eyes drifted to the window. Elijah stood across the street, speaking with the blacksmith, his hand resting easily on his holster, his stance sure. The boy she had loved was gone, replaced by a man who carried his scars with quiet pride. And yet, something in his expression, softness hidden behind strength, made her heart ache in a way she thought she had buried forever. When the bell rang and the first students arrived, she greeted them with warmth, letting their laughter and curiosity fill the room with light. She spoke about the power of learning, of stories, of second chances. And somewhere in her words, she was speaking to herself. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the entire town gathered for the welcoming meeting at the schoolhouse. Violet stood before them, hands clasped, speaking about education and hope. Her voice trembled at first, but grew steadier as she saw familiar faces, bakers, merchants, mothers, all listening kindly. And at the back of the room, Elijah, watching, his eyes not judging, not questioning, but holding hers as if he'd been waiting 8 years for this moment. When the meeting ended and the others drifted away, only the two of them remained in the glow of the lanterns. The silence between them was fragile, like glass. "You didn't have to hide your name," he said finally, his tone soft. "No one would have held your father's sins against you." "Wouldn't they?" she asked, turning toward him, her voice steady, but her heart trembling. Elijah's gaze was calm. "You were a victim too, Violet. You lost everything that day." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Including you." He took a small step closer. "Maybe not." The air between them thickened with all the words they hadn't spoken, all the years they hadn't lived together. Violet looked up at him, really looked, and saw the truth she had been running from. He had never stopped loving her. When she left that night, the stars above Redemption Creek seemed brighter, as though the heavens themselves were whispering a promise. Not every ending stays broken. Some just wait for the courage to begin again. And as Violet wrote in her journal before bed, her heart beating with a strange, fragile peace, she realized something she hadn't felt in years. Hope had returned, quiet but undeniable, blooming like the first wildflower after a long, merciless winter. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this. The sheriff's smile had awakened something long asleep inside her, and in that awakening there was forgiveness, warmth, and a whisper of healing, like sunlight on a wound that had finally begun to close. If this story touched something inside you, if you've ever longed for a love that remembers, for a heart that forgives, stay close. Like, share your thoughts, and subscribe for the next chapter. Sometimes the greatest stories begin when we dare to come home. The morning sun spread soft gold across Redemption Creek, warming the wooden porches and lighting the dust that hung in the still air. The bell from the small white church chimed faintly down the street, mingling with the rhythmic clop of horses' hooves and the distant hum of life waking in the frontier town. Violet stood by her window, the thin curtains fluttering against her wrist as she buttoned her dress. Below, children ran past laughing, a dog barked, and the aroma of fresh bread drifted from Mrs. Cooper's bakery. It all seemed so ordinary, so heartbreakingly familiar, as though the years she had spent away had folded into a dream. Yet inside her chest, her heart was a restless bird, remembering the man whose smile had undone 8 years of carefully built distance. At breakfast, Mrs. Wilkins poured coffee and asked polite questions about Violet's first day at the schoolhouse. The older woman's warmth was sincere, but beneath her kindly tone, Violet sensed a flicker of curiosity. The boarding house was alive with quiet gossip. The sheriff's interest in the new teacher had already begun to stir whispers through the town like wind through wheat. Violet tried to ignore them, answering softly, speaking of her plans for the children, her love for books, and how she hoped to plant a small garden outside the schoolhouse once spring came. After breakfast, she walked to school beneath a sky as blue as Elijah's eyes. The streets were busier now, filled with wagons and merchants calling to one another. A group of men loaded crates outside the general store, and when she passed, their conversation dipped for just a moment. Redemption Creek had always been that way. A place where every gesture became a story and every new face an invitation for speculation. She arrived early before the children to sweep the floor and arrange the slates. Her hands moved with habitual calm, but her mind kept wandering back to yesterday, to the way Elijah's voice had softened when he said her name, to the steadiness of his gaze that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She hated how easily he could still unmake her, how her breath seemed to catch just from remembering the curve of his smile. Yet there was healing in that ache. like the slow knitting of bone that had once been broken. By the time the students began to arrive, Violet's composure had returned. She greeted them with gentle laughter, her voice wrapping around their names with warmth. Lessons flowed easily that morning, reading, arithmetic, geography, and when one little girl stumbled over her sums and began to cry, Violet knelt beside her and whispered, "Every mistake is just a step toward understanding." The child smiled through tears, and something inside Violet settled. This was her purpose now. This was how she would begin again. At midday, while the children played outside, Violet sat at her desk, nibbling on a biscuit and watching the sunlight shimmer across the wooden floor. The door creaked open. Her heart knew who it was before she looked up. Elijah stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his presence filling the room like warmth after cold rain. "Afternoon, Miss Harrington," he said, his tone formal, but the corners of his lips betrayed the beginnings of a smile. "Sheriff Montgomery," she replied with equal restraint. "What brings you to the schoolhouse?" "Official business," he said, though his eyes gleamed with something less procedural. "Just making sure our new teacher's settling in all right." "I am," she said softly. "Thank you." For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them felt fragile, shimmering with unspoken memories. Elijah's gaze moved around the room, at the chalkboard, the neatly arranged books, the vase of wildflowers on the desk. "You've made this place feel alive again," he said finally. "I'm trying," she replied. "The children deserve somewhere they can dream." He nodded, thoughtful. Dreams keep a town breathing, even when it forgets how. Their eyes met, and the quiet stretched between them, rich and full. Violet looked away first, afraid he might see everything she was still trying to hide, the guilt, the longing, the lingering love. He cleared his throat, setting his hat against his chest. "The mayor asked me to remind you about the town supper tonight. It's tradition to welcome new folk properly." "I'd heard," she said, folding her hands to keep them steady. "I suppose it wouldn't be polite to refuse." "No," he said gently, "and it might be good for people to see you. They'll come to understand you're not your father's shadow." Violet flinched, the mention of her father like an old wound reopening. "Do they still speak of him?" "Some," Elijah admitted. "But most remember the banker's daughter who used to bring stray kittens into the store and blush whenever a certain ranch hand smiled at her." Her cheeks warmed despite herself. "That girl doesn't exist anymore." Elijah smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but I think she's still here somewhere, just waiting for a reason to breathe again." He tipped his hat and left, leaving Violet standing in the quiet room, her heart trembling with words she couldn't speak. That evening she dressed with care, a navy blue dress with white lace at the collar, modest but elegant. The mirror reflected a woman who looked calm, even confident, but inside she was all trembling light. She arrived at the town hall just as lanterns were being lit, their glow washing over the wooden walls like liquid gold. Music played softly from a fiddle, laughter echoed, and the smell of roast chicken and apple pie filled the air. People greeted her warmly. Mrs. Cooper, Mayor Thornton, young mothers with curious smiles. Yet, beneath the politeness, Violet felt the weight of eyes measuring, remembering. Redemption Creek might have forgiven, but it never forgot. Then Elijah entered, and the room seemed to shift. Conversations softened, and more than a few women turned to look at him. He wore his badge polished, his dark hair slightly damp, as if he'd run a hand through it moments before. When his gaze found hers, he smiled that slow, familiar smile that had once made her forget the world. He made his way to her side, every step deliberate. "Miss Harrington," he greeted, his tone rich with something unspoken. "May I escort you to your seat?" She hesitated only a second before nodding. His hand brushed hers, barely a touch, but enough to send a ripple of warmth through her. They sat together through the mayor's speech, through the introductions, through the gentle hum of conversation. Violet listened politely, though her thoughts danced like fireflies, catching only on the sound of Elijah's steady breathing beside her. When the meal ended, music began again. Couples moved to the cleared space near the front, where lantern light shimmered against polished boots and swirling skirts. Violet smiled faintly at the sight. It reminded her of the summer socials she had attended as a girl, the ones where she and Elijah had stolen glances across crowded rooms and whispered promises under the stars. "Would you care to dance?" His voice drew her back. "I don't think that would be appropriate," she began, but he only extended his hand, his eyes gentle. "It's a dance, Violet, not a scandal." Her name on his lips melted her resistance. She placed her hand in his. His palm was warm, his grip sure, and as he led her to the floor, the world around them blurred into color and motion. The music swelled, soft fiddle, slow rhythm. Elijah moved with quiet confidence, guiding her through each step as if no years had passed at all. She remembered every turn, every breath of closeness, the faint scent of leather and pine that clung to him. "You haven't forgotten," he murmured. "Forgotten what?" she asked, barely finding her voice. "How to belong in my arms." Her heart faltered. "Elijah," he smiled. "Forgive me, old habits." But she couldn't find anger, only the tender ache of memories that refused to fade. The warmth of his touch was not the wild passion of youth, but something deeper, steady, healing, like water flowing over stone. For the first time since she had returned, Violet felt the quiet possibility of peace. When the song ended, Elijah released her slowly, his gaze lingering on her face as though memorizing her all over again. "You did beautifully," he said softly. "I had a good partner." Their smiles met, tentative and real. Around them, the town continued to celebrate, unaware that something sacred was stirring again, something as fragile as forgiveness and as powerful as love reborn. Later that night, as she walked back to the boarding house beneath a sky full of stars, Violet carried the echo of his words and the warmth of his hands. She paused by the church, its white steeple glowing faintly in the moonlight, and closed her eyes. She prayed not for absolution, but for courage, for the strength to stay this time, to let herself be seen, to believe that love might still belong to her. Inside her room, the journal waited open on the desk. Her pen glided across the page. "Tonight, he looked at me as if the years between us were only a breath. The sheriff and the schoolteacher. It sounds almost proper. But when he smiled, I saw the boy who once promised to build a life for us out of dust and dreams. Maybe time doesn't destroy love. Maybe it distills it, until only the truest parts remain. His presence feels like sunlight after endless rain. I don't know where this path will lead, but for the first time in years, I want to walk it." She set the pen down, her eyes blurring with tears she didn't need to hide anymore. The night wrapped around her gently, the silence humming with peace. Somewhere beyond the window, she heard Elijah's horse trot past on patrol, the steady rhythm a promise in the dark. And as sleep claimed her, Violet's heart whispered the truth she was only beginning to understand. Sometimes love doesn't fade when forgotten. It waits quietly, like a seed beneath winter soil, ready to bloom the moment the sun dares to touch it again. The days ahead would bring more than she expected, choices, confessions, forgiveness. But for now, under the healing stillness of the Colorado night, all she felt was warmth, a quiet, living hope. And for those listening, if your heart has ever carried an old wound or waited for a smile that felt like home, stay with this story. Sometimes, in love as in life, the second beginning is the one that saves you. Like, share, and whisper your thoughts below. The story of healing is never finished until it's shared. The morning after the town supper dawned pale and tender, the kind of light that seemed to forgive everything it touched. Mist curled along the rooftops of Redemption Creek, softening its rough edges. The world smelled of dew and wood smoke, the fragile perfume of a town beginning its day. From her window, Violet watched the sun slowly crown the hills, painting the streets in gold. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to steady the quiet storm inside her. It had been years since she had danced, years since she had felt another soul's warmth so close. And yet, Elijah's hand at her waist had felt like something she'd known forever, something she had been missing without realizing it. At the breakfast table, Mrs. Wilkins chatted about the weather, about a shipment of coffee delayed from Denver, about the mayor's endless speeches. Violet smiled and nodded, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere, to the way Elijah's voice had lowered when he'd said her name, to the tenderness hidden beneath his teasing. When Mrs. Wilkins mentioned that the sheriff had stopped by earlier that morning, her heart gave a quiet leap. "He was asking if you'd made it home safely last night," Mrs. Wilkins said, pouring coffee into Violet's cup. "Such a considerate man, our sheriff, a rare breed these days." Violet murmured her thanks, hiding the soft blush that warmed her cheeks. She didn't know what frightened her more, that Elijah still cared, or that part of her had never stopped caring in return. The school day passed in a blur of laughter and sunlight. And the children were lively, full of the endless questions of youth. They recited their lessons, their voices overlapping in cheerful chaos. Each smile, each burst of giggling energy reminded Violet that life could still be simple, that innocence had not been entirely lost, only misplaced for a while. During recess, she stood under the shade of the old oak tree, watching them play tag, her heart lightened by their joy. Healing, she thought, often came disguised as small moments like this, quiet, ordinary, but deeply alive. In the afternoon, as she was dismissing her students, she noticed a shadow fall across the doorway. Elijah stood there, one hand resting lightly on the frame, his expression unreadable but kind. "Afternoon, Miss Harrington," he said, the same familiar calm in his voice. "Sheriff Montgomery," she replied, keeping her tone composed. "Come to arrest one of my pupils for excessive enthusiasm?" A small smile tugged at his lips. "Not unless they've been throwing ink again. I actually came to see you." Her heart fluttered, despite her effort to stay still. "Oh, has something happened?" He shook his head. "Nothing urgent. He hesitated, searching for words. "I wanted to ask if you'd walk with me this evening. There's something I'd like to talk about. If you're comfortable with that, of course." Violet hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse, to keep the distance safe and defined. But another part, the softer, braver part, knew this was inevitable. The past was already awake between them. There was no silencing it again. "I'll meet you after supper," she said quietly. That evening, the sun bled into the horizon, turning the sky to fire. Elijah waited by the gate of the boarding house, hat in hand, the light catching the fine dust on his boots. When Violet stepped outside, the soft glow of lamplight framed her in gold. She looked almost ethereal, her hair pinned neatly, her shawl wrapped close. They walked side by side down the road that led out of town. The air was cool and scented with pine. Crickets had begun their song, and somewhere far off a stream murmured softly. Neither spoke for a while. There was a kind of peace in the silence, the kind that belonged only to those who had known both sorrow and survival. Finally, Elijah broke the quiet. "You don't have to pretend, Violet. You can say what's in your heart." She drew a steadying breath. "And what is it you think I'm pretending?" "That you came back just to teach," he said gently. "You came back to face what you left behind." Her steps slowed. The road ahead stretched endlessly beneath the silver-blue sky. "Perhaps both," she said. "I told myself I wanted to make peace with this town, with what my father did. But sometimes I wonder if I came back because I never truly left." He turned toward her, his gaze tender. "You were 17, Violet. You lost everything. No one would have blamed you for running." "But you don't understand," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He destroyed people, Elijah, your family among them. Your father went to prison because of mine. How can you even stand to look at me?" Elijah stopped walking, his shadow stretching long across the road. The twilight caught the silver of his badge, the steady light in his eyes. "Because I know who you are," he said simply. "You're not your father's sin. You never were. And I learned a long time ago that hating ghosts only keeps you chained to them." The words sank deep, loosening something she hadn't realized she'd kept locked inside. Tears blurred her vision, but they weren't the sharp kind that burned. They were gentle, like rain that nourished instead of drowned. He took a step closer. "You don't have to keep punishing yourself. The past happened, Violet, but it doesn't have to keep happening." Her throat tightened. "Oh, how did you survive it? The humiliation, the loss?" "By choosing to build something better," he said softly. "I became sheriff to protect people, to give this town what it lost, trust. Maybe that's why you're back too, to rebuild what was broken in you." They walked again, slower this time, until they reached the old bridge over Willow Creek. The water below shimmered faintly in the dying light. Elijah leaned against the railing, his voice low. "Do you remember this place?" Violet nodded. "I remember every inch of it." "This is where I told you once that I'd wait for you," he said, a wistful smile touching his lips. "You laughed at me then." "I was young," she whispered. "You still are," he said. "But wiser now, stronger. I see it in you." She looked at him then, really looked, the lines of responsibility etched around his mouth, the scar across his brow, the kindness that had deepened in his eyes. The boy she had loved had become a man she could trust. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, resting it in his palm. It was her grandmother's locket. She gasped softly. "I kept it," he said, his voice steady but soft. After your father's estate was sold, this was found in the debris near the bank. I thought it might matter to you. She took it with trembling fingers, opening it slowly. Inside were two miniature portraits, one of her mother, the other of herself as a child. The sight made her heart ache with a sweetness almost too heavy to bear. You kept this all these years? I couldn't bring myself to throw away something that still had light in it, he replied. Just like I couldn't stop believing you'd come home one day. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the creek murmuring below, eternal and unhurried. When Violet finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I never meant to leave you without a word. I wrote you a letter, but never sent it. I was too ashamed. Elijah's gaze softened. I know. Her eyes widened. You know? He nodded slowly. Your cousin sent them to me. The ones you never mailed. There were 5 in all. I've read them more times than I can count. Heat rose in her cheeks, shame and disbelief colliding. Those were never meant to be seen. I think they were, he said gently. Maybe not when you wrote them, but someday. They told me what I already knew, that your heart was never cruel, just wounded. Her lips trembled, the weight of old regret pressing against the fragile hope that had begun to bloom. You should hate me. I never could, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Every time I tried, all I remembered was the girl who used to bring me bread from her kitchen when I couldn't afford a meal, the girl who looked at me like I was worth more than I believed. You were my home long before you left it. Violet turned away, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. I don't deserve that kind of love. Maybe not, he said softly, but sometimes love doesn't care what we deserve. It just stays. The air grew still around them, filled with the hush of something sacred. The moon rose, silvering the world, wrapping them in its gentle light. Elijah reached out, his fingertips brushing away her tears with reverence. Let yourself breathe again, Violet, he murmured. You've carried this pain long enough. Something broke open inside her, not in destruction, but in release. For the first time in years, she felt free enough to cry without fear. Elijah drew her close, not in passion, but in peace. She rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady rhythm of his heart. It felt like home, like the quiet after a storm. They stood that way for a long while, neither speaking, letting the past dissolve into the sound of water and wind. And when she finally stepped back, there was light in her eyes again, fragile, but real. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For seeing me. He smiled faintly. I never stopped. As they walked back toward town, the night wrapped around them softly. The lanterns along Main Street glowed like little stars, and Violet felt something stir deep inside, a promise of peace she hadn't dared to hope for. She glanced at Elijah, his face calm and sure, and thought that maybe redemption wasn't something you earned. Maybe it was something given, freely, quietly, through the grace of someone who refused to give up on you. That night, in her journal, she wrote, He held my heart as if it were made of glass, not to break it, but to keep it from shattering any further. Perhaps love after ruin is not a second chance, but a resurrection. Maybe forgiveness is what makes love eternal. As her candle flickered low, Violet smiled through the tears that had turned soft with peace. The pain was still there, but it no longer ruled her. It had transformed, becoming something gentler, something almost beautiful. And as she drifted into sleep, the faint sound of hoofbeats echoed outside, a rhythm steady as faith. In her dreams, she saw Elijah's smile beneath the stars, a promise that the story between them had only just begun. The days that followed carried a softness Violet hadn't felt in years. The town moved through the rhythm of early autumn, amber light spilling over the hills, the scent of apples drifting from Mrs. Cooper's bakery, children chasing one another through drifts of falling leaves. Redemption Creek seemed to breathe with her, as though the quiet life she had returned to was slowly, tenderly wrapping her in forgiveness. She still felt the weight of what had passed between her and Elijah that night by the creek, the memory of his words lingering like warmth after rain. Something had shifted. It was as if the walls she'd built around her heart were not torn down, but quietly dissolved, piece by piece, by the steady kindness in his eyes. He began to appear more often, sometimes with a polite excuse, sometimes with none at all. On mornings when she was sweeping the schoolhouse porch, she would see him ride by on patrol, his hand lifting slightly in greeting, his smile disarming in its simplicity. Once, when she struggled with a loose window shutter, he appeared as if summoned by thought itself, fixing it in silence before tipping his hat and walking away. There was a gentleness in his presence, a patience that made her ache with something too deep for words. In the evenings she wrote in her journal, trying to make sense of the tangle of feelings returning to life within her. She no longer wrote of guilt or shame, but of renewal, of laughter in the schoolyard, of children's trust, of the soft blue of the mountains at dusk. Healing, she realized, was not a single moment of redemption. It was 100 small mercies gathered day by day. Yet even as peace began to bloom, the shadow of her past still lingered. Some faces in town softened when they spoke to her, others still watched with guarded eyes. She could feel it when she passed the general store or walked through the market, the unspoken question of whether she had returned to rebuild or to pretend nothing had ever happened. Violet faced it with quiet dignity, though at times her heart trembled. It was a Sunday afternoon when Elijah came to call formally. The sound of his boots on the boarding-house steps made her pulse quicken. Mrs. Wilkins, ever the benevolent chaperone, nearly glowed with delight as she ushered him in. "Sheriff Montgomery, such an honor," she said, bustling about. "Miss Harrington is just upstairs, but I'll fetch her directly." Violet appeared moments later, her cheeks tinged with rose. She wore a pale lavender dress, and her hair was pinned loosely, a few curls escaping to frame her face. Elijah rose as she entered, his eyes softening at the sight. "I hope this isn't an intrusion," he said. "I wanted to ask if you'd join me for a walk before supper." Mrs. Wilkins all but beamed. "A fine idea. The evening air is lovely. Go on, Miss Harrington. Don't keep the sheriff waiting." They stepped out into the fading sunlight, the world gilded and calm. The main street glowed with the warm tones of the setting sun, and the sounds of town life hummed quietly around them. Laughter spilling from the saloon, the creak of wagon wheels, the scent of smoke curling from chimneys. Elijah offered his arm, and Violet hesitated only a second before accepting. They walked without destination, their pace unhurried, the silence between them easy. "The children speak highly of you," Elijah said after a while. "They say you read them stories about faraway lands and heroes who find their way home." "They like the idea of home," Violet replied softly. Most of them were born here and will probably never leave. But I want them to dream, to believe they can become more than what the world expects. You've given them that, he said. You've given this town that again. Hope. His words struck her more deeply than she expected. For years she had thought herself a ghost, someone who had no right to inspire hope. To hear him say it made her chest ache in the sweetest way. They reached the edge of town, where the land opened toward the fields. The light had turned to honey, the air filled with the sound of cicadas and the faint rustle of grass. Elijah stopped near a fence, resting his hands on the rail. "I want to tell you something," he began quietly. "Something I've never told anyone." She waited, her gaze fixed on him. "When my father came home from prison, he wasn't the same man," he said. "He'd lost everything, the ranch, his pride, his peace. I spent years angry at your father, at mine, at the world. But anger only hollowed me out. I became a deputy, thinking justice would fill that emptiness. It didn't. Not until I learned that justice without mercy isn't justice at all." His eyes lifted to hers. "That's when I started to understand forgiveness, not as a favor to others, but as a way to stop bleeding." Her throat tightened. "You make it sound so simple." "It isn't," he admitted. "It took me years. But I believe people can change. I've seen it. In this town, in myself. And I see it in you." She blinked against the tears gathering in her eyes. "I'm trying, Elijah. Every day, I'm trying." He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Then you're already halfway there." They stood together as the sun slipped behind the mountains, a quiet peace settling around them. When they finally returned to the boarding house, Mrs. Wilkins pretended not to notice the soft glow in Violet's cheeks or the tenderness in the sheriff's voice when he said good night. The next morning, Redemption Creek awoke to bright skies and the promise of the Harvest Festival on the horizon. The town buzzed with preparation. Ribbons were hung, pies baked, and the air filled with excitement. The festival was the year's most anticipated event, a day of music, food and dancing beneath strings of lanterns. For Violet, it carried a different meaning. It would be the first time she would stand fully in the open, not as a stranger, but as part of the community she once abandoned. Elijah visited the schoolhouse that week under the pretense of security arrangements. The children adored him, surrounding him with questions about his badge and horse, and he indulged them with laughter that made the whole room brighter. Violet watched him from her desk, her heart swelling with quiet admiration. The man who once swung hammers and mended fences had become a pillar of steadiness, a light this town depended on. Later, when the students had gone, he lingered by the door. "Will you be at the festival?" "I wouldn't dare miss it," she said with a small smile. He tilted his head slightly. "Then save me a dance." The warmth in his tone left her flustered. She nodded, pretending to tidy her desk, though her hands trembled. "One dance," she murmured. "One is all I'll need," he replied, and his grin was soft but sure, the kind that made her heart flutter long after he'd gone. The week raced by in a blur of anticipation. Every evening brought whispers about the sheriff and the teacher, whether their shared glances meant what everyone suspected, whether the scandal of the past might turn into something the town could finally bless. Violet tried to ignore it, focusing on her lessons, yet she couldn't deny the quiet excitement that grew each day. On the night of the festival, the town square shimmered under the glow of 100 lanterns. Music drifted from the bandstand, cheerful and bright. Violet arrived in a forest green dress with delicate lace at the cuffs, a ribbon tied in her hair. Mrs. Wilkins fussed over her before she left, insisting she looked just like spring come alive. When Elijah found her among the crowd, his breath caught for a fraction of a second. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice low, reverent. "And you look like you've been rehearsing that compliment," she teased, but the blush that colored her cheeks betrayed her delight. He laughed softly, offering his arm. "Shall we?" They danced beneath the lanterns, the music wrapping around them like a living thing. The world fell away until it was just them, their laughter, their shared breath, the unspoken understanding that this was more than nostalgia. This was something reborn, fragile, but real. As the song slowed, Elijah's hand found hers, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm. "You're not running anymore," he whispered. "I don't want to," she said. The crowd's noise faded, leaving only the rhythm of the music and their hearts moving together in quiet harmony. When the dance ended, he didn't let go right away. Instead, he led her toward the old oak tree at the edge of the square, its branches glowing with lantern light. "This tree's seen everything," he said softly. "When I was younger, I used to sit under it and pray you'd come back. Every autumn I'd tell myself maybe next year." She touched the rough bark, her voice barely a breath. "And now I'm here." "And now you're here," he echoed. "And I don't ever want you to leave again." She looked up at him, her heart trembling in its cage. The longing between them was quiet but powerful, an ache that felt less like pain and more like awakening. He leaned in, not to claim her, but to promise her something wordless: his patience, his faith, his enduring love. The night deepened, the stars spilling silver across the sky. They stayed beneath the oak until the last lantern burned low, speaking softly of everything and nothing, of the school children, of the town, of dreams for what might come next. When Elijah finally walked her home, their hands brushed once more, and in that simple touch was everything they didn't yet dare say. Later, in her room, Violet wrote with trembling fingers, "Love is not a thunderstorm, but a sunrise. It comes quietly, gently, until you realize the darkness has faded and everything is warm again." Tonight, beneath the oak tree, I understood that forgiveness is the root of love, and love is the beginning of healing. I am no longer afraid. She set down her pen, the night air sweet through the window. Below, the town slept, lanterns flickering out one by one. Somewhere down the street, she could almost hear the sheriff's voice, low and steady, bidding her good night in silence. And as she closed her eyes, peace washed over her like light through stained glass, soft, forgiving, endlessly new, guiding her gently toward the next chapter of their story. The weeks after the harvest festival passed in a gentle blur of sunlight and small joys. Autumn lingered longer than usual that year, as if the land itself refused to let go of its warmth. Mornings were soft with fog that curled between the hills, and evenings arrived like silk, quiet and golden. Violet's days settled into a rhythm that felt almost holy, teaching, tending to her students, walking home beneath the setting sun with the weight of contentment resting gently on her shoulders. Yet beneath that peace, her heart pulsed with something alive and trembling. Every time she saw Elijah riding down Main Street or standing near the blacksmith's forge, his hand resting on his belt, she felt the quiet pull of inevitability. Their paths crossed often now. Sometimes it was intentional, Elijah stopping by the schoolhouse with an excuse about town matters. Other times it was pure chance, their eyes meeting in church across rows of bowed heads, or their hands brushing at the market when both reached for the same jar of preserves. Each encounter left Violet with the same ache she had felt when they danced. The ache of something once lost, now reborn, fragile as spring light. She had come to understand that healing didn't erase the past. It wove it into something gentler. The pain that had once consumed her had become a kind of wisdom, the quiet knowing that love, when it returned, could be softer, slower, and more enduring. One crisp morning, she stood outside the schoolhouse, her breath forming clouds in the chill air. The children were chasing one another in the yard, their laughter echoing through the clear sky. She was writing something on the chalkboard when she heard the familiar sound of boots on wooden steps. "Elijah," she said, before she even turned. He smiled at her easy recognition. "I'm predictable, am I?" "Reliable," she corrected. "There's a difference." He stepped inside, removing his hat. "The mayor asked me to deliver this." He handed her a folded letter stamped with the town's seal. She opened it and scanned the contents. "They're expanding the schoolhouse," she breathed, her voice filling with disbelief. "They're really doing it." "You've earned it," Elijah said softly. "You've done more for this town in a few months than anyone expected." Her eyes lifted to his. "It wasn't just me. Redemption Creek is healing too. Maybe we're doing it together." He looked at her for a long moment, something tender flickering behind his steady gaze. "You always had a way of making people believe in good things again," he said. Violet blushed and tried to focus on the letter, but her hands trembled slightly. "There will be a meeting to discuss the expansion," she said. "Tomorrow evening." "I'll be there," he promised. The next evening, the schoolhouse was filled with townsfolk, farmers, merchants, mothers and children, all speaking eagerly about plans for the new classroom. The room glowed with lamplight and laughter. Violet stood near the front, answering questions, her eyes bright with gratitude. When she spoke about the children's future, her voice trembled with emotion. "Education," she said, "is how a town remembers who it is. We give our children roots so they can grow wings." Applause rippled through the crowd, and when she glanced toward the back, Elijah was watching her with quiet pride. His presence steadied her. He didn't need to speak. His gaze said everything. "I see you, and I'm proud." After the meeting ended and the others drifted away, Elijah lingered. He moved closer, the sound of his spurs faint in the hush. "You belong here," he said simply. Violet's breath caught. "Do you really believe that?" "I've never believed anything more." She smiled faintly. "It still feels strange sometimes, to walk the same streets that once whispered about me." He shook his head. "They whisper differently now." She laughed softly. "Do they? Now they say the sheriff's got eyes for the schoolteacher." Her laughter died into quiet warmth. "And does he?" His eyes deepened with that familiar light. He never stopped. The silence that followed was not awkward, but sacred. The kind that settles only between two people who have known both distance and return. Elijah took a step closer, and Violet didn't retreat. The air between them pulsed with unspoken truth. "I need to show you something," he said at last. "If you'll trust me." always. They walked through the dim streets together, past the shuttered windows and the glow of oil lamps burning low. The town slept peacefully around them. Beyond the church, the path sloped upward toward the hills. They reached a small white house perched on a rise above the valley. Moonlight washed over its porch, the air scented faintly of pine and rain. When Elijah stopped before it, Violet realized where they were. Her father's house. She froze. The sight struck her like an echo of everything she had tried to bury. The laughter that once filled its rooms, the night it had all fallen apart, the shame that followed. Her hands trembled. "Elijah, I can't." He turned to her, his voice gentle but firm. "You can. Not because you owe the past anything, but because this house isn't what it was. It's what it became." He stepped forward and opened the door. Candlelight glowed inside, revealing rooms transformed. Simple wooden furniture, soft curtains, the faint scent of bread and wood oil. Gone were the heavy drapes, the ornate chandeliers. Everything here felt lighter, alive. Violet walked inside slowly, her breath catching with each step. "It's different." "I bought it years ago," Elijah said quietly. "No one else wanted it. People said it was cursed, haunted by what happened. But I couldn't stand to see it rot. So I rebuilt it, board by board, wall by wall." Her throat tightened. "You lived here?" He nodded. It felt right, like I was keeping a promise I never got to keep. She turned to him, her eyes shimmering. "You rebuilt this house for me." He hesitated, his voice low. "At first, I didn't know that's what I was doing. I just wanted to make something whole again. But over time, I realized I wasn't fixing a house. I was waiting for you." The words broke through her composure. She pressed a hand to her lips, trying to hold back the tide of emotion rising within her. "You waited," she whispered. "All this time." "Every day," he said softly. "I told myself that if you ever came back, there would be something here that could welcome you, something that didn't hurt anymore." Violet moved through the parlor, her fingertips brushing the smooth surface of the wooden table, the new paint on the walls, the small vase of fresh flowers that spoke of care and gentleness. Each detail was a heartbeat, a message left waiting for her. "Elijah," she murmured, her voice trembling, "I don't deserve this kind of grace." He stepped closer, his eyes unwavering. "Grace isn't deserved. It's given. The same way love is." She looked up at him, and the years of silence between them collapsed like dust. He reached out, touching a strand of hair that had escaped her bun, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. His touch was warm, reverent, steady. "You've carried sorrow for too long," he whispered. "Let it rest." She closed her eyes, the tears finally falling, not heavy, but soft, cleansing. "How did you forgive me?" "I didn't have to," he said. "You were never the one who needed forgiving." The world stilled around them. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the wind sighed against the window. When she opened her eyes again, he was still there, patient, unwavering, the same soul who had loved her through time and distance. She took a breath that felt like her first in years. "Show me the rest," she said. He smiled and led her through the house, into the small kitchen where the scent of bread lingered, into the study lined with books and sunlight, and finally to a corner room where the moonlight poured in through a wide window. "I found something here when I was fixing the floor," he said, opening a drawer in the desk. He handed her a small wooden box, its lid worn smooth. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside lay her mother's jewelry, a pearl brooch, a gold locket, a ring she had thought lost forever. The sight of them stole her breath. "I can't believe this." "They were hidden under the floorboards," Elijah said. "I kept them safe, waiting for the day I could return them." Her fingers brushed the locket, and the memories came rushing back. Her mother's laughter, the scent of lilac perfume, the promise of love that had once filled this house. It didn't hurt the same way anymore. It felt like remembering a song she'd once known by heart. When she looked back at Elijah, her tears had turned into something brighter. "You've given me my past back," she said, "but it doesn't feel heavy anymore." He reached for her hand. "That's because it's no longer yours to carry alone." In that moment, everything within her stilled, the ache, the guilt, the longing, and what replaced it was peace. The kind of peace that felt like coming home after a storm. They stood together in the quiet, the world outside bathed in moonlight. And when he leaned in, his lips brushing hers, it wasn't the desperate kiss of lost youth. It was the slow, certain joining of two souls who had walked through sorrow and found each other again. The kiss deepened with time and tenderness, their hearts moving in unison. Years of separation melted away, replaced by the quiet truth that love, real love, never fades. It waits, patient and enduring, until both hearts are ready to return. When they finally drew apart, Violet's smile trembled but did not falter. "This place," she whispered, "it doesn't feel haunted anymore." "It never was," Elijah said softly. "It was only waiting to be loved again." As the fire burned low, they sat together on the old wooden bench, their hands entwined. Outside, the wind carried the scent of cedar and distant rain, and the stars watched quietly through the window. For the first time in years, Violet felt no distance between who she was and who she was becoming. She was both, the girl who once fled and the woman who had returned, whole and forgiven. Before she left that night, Elijah walked her to the door. She paused on the porch, the moonlight silvering her hair. "I used to think redemption meant punishment," she said. "But now I see it's about love, about choosing to stay." He smiled, his voice low and sure. "Then stay, Violet. Stay this time." She didn't answer, but her hand lingered in his until words were no longer needed. Later, as she lay in bed, the scent of pine still clinging to her shawl, she wrote in her journal, "I saw the house again tonight, the one that held my worst memories. But now it's full of light. He turned my past into a home. Maybe love isn't something that finds you once. Maybe it's what keeps waiting patiently until you're strong enough to return." Her handwriting trailed into softness, and sleep found her like a blessing. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest promise that love, once reborn, would never be lost again. Winter came early to Redemption Creek that year, not with blizzards or fury, but with a shy hush that made the town sound softer. Boots quieter on the boardwalks, church bells rounder in the cold air. The hills wore a pale veil at dawn, and smoke rose from chimneys like gentle prayers. In the schoolhouse, children rubbed their hands together for warmth and giggled into their scarves, and Violet, with sleeves rolled and cheeks flushed, moved among the benches, lighting the little iron stove, grateful for heat and simple work. Word of the expansion travelled as quickly as laughter. Men measured the far wall and tapped at studs with knuckles. Women discussed shelves and windows where light should fall on eager faces. Older students carried planks with the pride of apprentices. Every new sound, a saw's rhythm, a hammer's heartbeat, stitched Violet deeper into the living fabric of the town. She noticed the change the way one notices a fever breaking, first in tiny mercies, then in a flood of ease. Mrs. Dawson lingered after lessons to send home a jar of currant jam. Mr. Jenkins, who had once crossed the road rather than share a sidewalk with her, tipped his hat and asked if his oldest might help with the shelves. Even the saloon piano softened its nightly tunes, as if the music itself understood that the town was healing in places no one could see. But not all faces were easy. Violet knew which window she passed that held tighter curtains, which shoulders stiffened when she walked by. She did not apologize to the air. She saved her words for those whose eyes were willing to meet hers. The chance came on a wind-scoured afternoon outside the general store, where Frances Miller stood with a paper parcel tucked close to her chest. The widow's shawl was thin, her mouth set in that familiar line of endurance, but her eyes, grey, unflinching, carried no malice, only memory. "Miss Miller," Violet said, voice steady, heart thundered. "Miss Harrington," Frances returned, formal as winter frost. Violet gathered every quiet hour of prayer, every promise she had made herself in lamplight, and let them steady her next breath. "I can't give back what was taken," she said softly, "but I can bear my share. I've put aside part of my pay each month. It isn't much, but it is yours if you'll take it." Frances studied her for a long moment, long enough for the cold to nibble Violet's fingers through her gloves. Then the older woman shook her head. "No," she said. Violet's stomach dipped. But Frances's voice had changed. The iron had gentled. "You've paid more than coin could ever count," she said. "You came back and stood in the square with your chin up. You teach our children with kindness no scandal could sour. Keep your money for a better stove. Keep it for books and boots and small hands that will need both." Violet's throat burned. "I don't know how to thank you." "Live here," Frances said simply. "Let the past be past. See that you don't hurt the sheriff. He's a good man." Something like light flickered at the edge of her severity. "A rare one." "I won't," Violet said, and something in her voice carried the weight of a vow. By week's end, the town council posted a notice. Work on the school addition would begin as soon as the ground froze hard enough for the foundation. The children treated it as a holiday. They drew chalk plans on slates, rooms with stars on the ceiling, and windows that opened to the sky. Elijah, leaning in the doorway with his hat in his hands and that quiet look that always undid her, watched as Violet knelt to examine a particularly ambitious design. "A telescope," she read, smiling, "for charting the constellations." "Ambitious," he said, eyes warm. "The night keeps its promises if you mark them," she replied, and when she looked up, she found him already gazing at her as if she were one. He didn't say much that afternoon, didn't need to. He moved a crate here, lifted a desk there, adjusted the stove's draft with practiced fingers. When one little boy slipped and skinned his knee, Elijah knelt on the floorboards, slower than a man with a badge, gentler than a lawman needs to be, and tied a clean strip of cloth around the small leg with a bow so tidy the child forgot to cry. Violet watched him through the wavering heat above the stove, the quiet in her chest like a cup filling. Sunday brought a sky of unbroken blue and a sermon about grace that felt like it had been written in the space between two people on an oak-shadowed evening. After the service, a single-file line of well-wishers formed without announcement. Mrs. Cooper pressed a pie into Violet's arms with bossy affection. Old Mr. Pike, who pretended not to hear so he could avoid conversation, heard perfectly when he said, "Fine work with the little ones, miss," and shuffled away before tears betrayed him. Even Mayor Thornton's boasting found a new register. He clapped Elijah on the shoulder and declared, for anyone within wind's reach, that Redemption Creek knew how to recognize its own. Then winter made its first true showing, a wind that polished the roads to bone and laid a hard edge on the air. Early one morning, a bloom of smoke smudged the sky above the livery. Fire ran along hay like gossip. Bells rang. Men shouted. Buckets moved hand to hand in a chain as old as towns. Violet was halfway down Main Street before she recognized her own legs carrying her. Elijah's voice rose above the din, steady, commanding, shard clear. He directed the spray, broke open a side door with his shoulder, and vanished into smoke thick as wool. A boy's cry cut through the crowd. "My pup!" Tommy Jenkins gulped air, wild-eyed, small body racked with a grief he did not yet know how to shape. "Please, Sheriff, please!" Violet didn't think. She pressed a kerchief to the child's face, guided him backward from the heat, and met the mother's frantic grip with calm, simple words. "He heard you," she said. "He won't let any soul go alone." Time stretched, the span of a heartbeat, the shape of a prayer. Then Elijah stumbled out into the thin winter sun with the coughing dog tucked under his coat, face blackened, hair singed, eyes startling and bright. The boy's sob became laughter. The crowd's relief split into a sound like a blessing. After the fire was tamed and the smoke thinned to a memory, Violet found Elijah seated on a curb, a strip of clean linen pressed to a burn on his forearm. She sank beside him, her skirts pooling on the cold boardwalk, and took his wrist in both hands. "Reckless," she murmured, smoothing the cloth as if tenderness itself could cool the heat. "Necessary," he countered, voice rough, softened by the way he looked at her. "You should have seen the look on that boy's face." "I did," she said, and only then realized her own face was wet. He touched a tear with a blackened thumb, an apology and a promise in one small gesture. "It's all right," he said, and this time she understood he meant more than smoke and singed hair. That evening, Redemption Creek brought food until the livery owner's table bowed, stews and breads and apples baked soft with cinnamon. Someone started a song that didn't quite hold together, and it didn't matter. Violet stood in the doorway with a pot in her hands, watching strangers become neighbors with the simple bravery of shared labor. When Elijah slipped through the crowd to reach her, his sleeve tucked neatly over his bandage, the room did not quiet, as it might have weeks ago. It merely widened so there would be space for the two of them to stand together. "You're shivering," he said, his brow creasing. "I'm not cold," she answered, surprised by the truth. Snow came at last in a hush that felt like consent. The schoolyard became a bright page for bootprints and laughter. Violet taught fractions with slices of pear and let the older children read aloud by the window, their voices sweet and certain. On Fridays, she wrapped books in cloth and walked the long road to a far homestead where a mother of 4 wanted to learn her letters after the little ones slept. Word of it travelled, not as gossip, but as pride. People began to wave before they remembered who she had been. Eventually, they remembered and waved anyway. One evening, she and Elijah climbed the hill behind the White House to where the land broke open to the night. She had never grown out of the child's thrill of first stars. He pointed out the constellations with a tenderness that made the cold irrelevant, each name like a verse of something holy. Orion, Taurus, the Pleiades clustered like small lamps. "Which do you claim?" he asked quietly. She tilted her head, gauging the sky with a schoolteacher's care and a woman's wish. "The little ones," she said at last. "The ones that look like promises. They're easy to lose if you don't look for them. But once you know where to find them, you can always find your way." He watched her in profile, the starlight laying silver on her cheekbones, and something in his face moved, an old door opening on oiled hinges. "I've kept a promise," he said, barely above the wind. She met his gaze, and there was nothing tremulous in her now. "I know." They didn't kiss there. They didn't need to. It was more intimate than that. 2 people standing very still and letting the future settle around them like a warm coat. When he reached for her hand, she gave it without a single ghost tugging at her sleeve. Days grew shorter, then longer again, as if the year learned in front of them how to turn toward hope. Work began on the school foundation. The first swing of the pick rang like a bell. Violet brought coffee to the men and wrote neat lists of lumber while the women measured curtains. Children peered over sawhorses with reverence, as if the room itself were a story they would someday tell their own. In the afternoons, Elijah stopped by with an apple in his pocket, offered to any small scholar whose sums added up to kindness. He never left without words for Violet, even if it was only a low evening that tucked itself into her coat like a secret. There were still difficult hours. Memory is not a lake you cross only once. Sometimes, while sweeping the schoolhouse, a smell, ink, wax, smoke, would open a door inside her, and she would stand very still in old hurt. But she did not drown there anymore. She carried a lifeline now that looped through the hands of children and neighbors, and a man whose steadiness had become the ground beneath her feet. On those days, she would walk to the White House and sit on the back steps until Elijah came out with 2 mugs and no questions. They would watch the light slip through the branches and talk about small things with the relief of travelers who have finally learned the road home by heart. He began to talk about spring as if it were a certainty, and she let herself answer in the same tense. He told her of an idea for a hospital, 2 rooms and a cot to begin, a place where mothers would be less afraid. She described a lending library and night lessons and a long table where anyone could sit down and learn to write their name. He spoke about roads. She spoke about roads through the mind, and as they traced their plans, she realized they were building more than projects. They were building a life with the easy authority of 2 hands, doing the work they were made to do together. One snowy afternoon, Frances Miller stepped into the schoolhouse carrying a neatly folded shawl of deep blue yarn. "I found this in the bottom of a trunk," she said, suddenly awkward. "Belonged to your mother. I kept it because it was warm and I was angry." Her mouth tilted, a brief admission of humor. "I don't find myself as angry these days. Thought you might, well, if it suits you." Violet pressed the wool to her cheek. It smelled faintly of cedar and old winters. "It suits me very much," she said. Francis nodded once, brisk as a blessing, and turned to go. At the door, she paused. "You look like her when you laugh," she said without turning. "It's good to see." After the door closed, Violet sat with the shawl around her shoulders and let a long, steady quiet fill her. She had not known she had been waiting for that kind of return until it arrived. By the time the first thaw loosened the frozen ruts on Main Street, the town had accepted what some claimed they'd always known, and others said they never would. The sheriff and the schoolteacher belonged in the same sentence. No announcement had been made. None was necessary. It showed in the way Mrs. Wilkins set an extra plate without comment, in how children left small treasures on Violet's desk, a feather, a smooth stone, a candy saved from Sunday, and made sure the sheriff saw their offerings when he happened by. It showed most plainly in the way Elijah's expression shifted when Violet entered a room, a softening around the eyes, a stillness that said the world could wait. On a clear evening that smelled faintly of thawing earth and new wood, Elijah stopped by the schoolhouse as Violet was erasing the day's sums with the flat of her hand. He watched the white trail map the black slate, then crossed the room and took the cloth from her without a word, as if this too were a thing they could share. When the board stood clean, he hung the cloth carefully and turned. "Tomorrow," he said slowly, "I'd like to show you something. Not the house. Something I've been saving." Violet held his gaze. "All right." "I don't know if I have the right words yet," he admitted, a rare uncertainty threading his voice. "But I've been practicing the feeling for 8 years. Her smile was quiet and sure. "Then the words will find you." He looked relieved and a little undone, as men do when they recognize the moment they have been walking toward it. "After church? I'll meet you under the oak," she said, and the way the promise settled between them lifted the room into brightness. They stood very close without moving, late light laying a blessing on the new wall studs and the old floor. Outside, a wagon rattled past, a dog barked, a child called for someone to wait. Inside, time narrowed to a hush and a heartbeat. "Violet," he said. "Elijah," she answered. It was not a question and not an answer, only their names as a kind of vow. When she blew out the lamp and they stepped into the evening, the sky wore its first thin scarf of spring. The town breathed. The creek ran clear. And beneath the oak tree, quiet witness to everything they had been and everything they might become, the next chapter waited with the patience of something certain and kind. Sunday's light fell like a benediction over Redemption Creek, clear and gentle, ringing the church bell in a tone so round it seemed to settle in the chest instead of the air. Violet felt it hum through her bones as she sat in the pew with her palms folded, the scent of wood polish and winter coats and beeswax candles making the simple sanctuary feel like a cradle. Reverend Parker spoke of patience, not the passive kind, but the steady choosing of love across ordinary days. She did not need to look to know Elijah was 2 rows back and a little to the side. Her heart found him the way a bird finds north. When the final hymn lifted, she didn't hurry. Children tugged sleeves and scuffed boots. Women straightened hats, men shrugged into their coats and greeted one another with the warm economy of neighbors. Violet moved through it all as if the air had become water, and she knew how to breathe underwater. Outside, the morning was bright but soft, as if a hand had brushed the sky and smudged the edges of the cold. Elijah waited beneath the oak, hat in hand, the wind loosening the dark at his temples. He looked not like a sheriff or a legend, but like a vow that had learned to stand on 2 feet. "You keep your appointments," she said, and the smile that followed was as much for herself as for him. "I've been keeping this one for years," he answered, and the quiet broke like a shell around a living thing. They walked until the church chatter faded into the distance, and the creek carried only water and light. The oak threw a broad shadow across the pale grass. The hill beyond held the town like a cupped palm. Elijah set his hat on the low branch he had used as a boy, and turned to her with a breath that seemed to pull the world into focus. "I don't have the right words," he said, "but I have the right meaning." He reached into his coat and drew out a small box, the color of worn bark. "I've carried this through seasons, through doubt and harvest, through fire and the kind of silence that listens. I thought I'd know the exact sentence when the day came. I don't. But I know the feeling." He opened the box. A ring lay inside, silver leaves curving around a single pearl, soft as moonlight. Violet did not gasp. She grew very still, the stillness that happens when a hurt finally finds its healer. He took the ring between his fingers, and his voice gentled beyond anything she had ever heard from him, as if the words were not passing across his tongue, but across his heart. "It was my grandmother's. She said a pearl is made when an irritation stays long enough to become beauty. I've thought about you every day for 8 years, not as an ache I couldn't cure, but as a tender thing that kept me honest. I rebuilt your father's house to learn my hands. I wore a badge to learn my courage. I read your letters to learn my hope. If you'll let me, I'd like to spend what's left of my days learning how to keep you well loved." "Violet." He swallowed, and the name sounded like a promise. "Marry me." Her throat closed on the simplest answer. Wind moved through the oak like a quiet choir. She thought of the girl who ran, of the woman who returned, of the man who waited without bitterness, who stepped into flames for a boy's dog and came back laughing. She held out her hand because her body knew what to do, even while her thoughts were busy praying their gratitude. "Yes," she managed, and then, stronger, clean as creek water, "Yes, Elijah Montgomery." The ring slid home like a story finding its true ending. When he kissed her, it wasn't a shout to the world. It was a soft sealing, a warmth that spread outward, the way Thor spreads across a field, edge first, quietly, everywhere at once. They stood together, forehead to forehead, and knew without speaking that the oak would remember this day the way the creek remembered spring. News does what it does in small towns. It walked on cheerful feet. By afternoon, Mrs. Cooper pressed cinnamon rolls into their hands for stamina, and Mayor Thornton decided an impromptu speech was absolutely called for in front of the church steps. Frances Miller approached with a slow step and a shawl pulled tight, her eyes sharp and kind all at once. "You'll do," she told Elijah with an authority that made him look briefly like the boy he'd once been. Then to Violet, "You've done your penance. Now do your living." The blessing landed like a hand on the crown of her head. They did not linger in town. They walked up the hill to the White House that had learned their names before they ever knew to say them together, and Elijah opened the door like a man opening a book he loved. Inside, the fire made the room's shadows soft. He took her coat as if she were glass, and then, catching himself, as if she were oak. "You're trembling," he said. "I'll keep doing that for a while," she admitted, smiling with the shyness that comes when joy arrives and you must introduce it to your bones. "I'm not afraid." "Good," he said. "I promised myself I wouldn't rush this. We can do everything with the door open and the lamps bright. We can make soup and not talk and talk and not make soup. We can decide the date when the ground tells us it's ready to hold us steady." She laughed, and it sounded like a girl who had finally convinced the woman she would be allowed to laugh again. "May?" she said, surprising herself with the audacity of it. "If the lilacs are kind." "The lilacs obey you," he said gravely, which made her laugh harder, which made him look like a man who had just watched the world choose him on purpose. They fell into a rhythm that did not feel like planning so much as listening. The town offered what towns offer when they have forgiven and would like to be part of your future, Mrs. Parsons and the ladies set to sewing before Violet could say modest or lace. The blacksmith insisted on shaping the small ring that would sit beside the pearl and make a circle of it. Children collected posies of imagined flowers in mittened hands and argued about whether their teacher preferred white or purple. Elijah, who had always been good at letting people be exactly who they were, let the town be noisy in its tenderness and saved the holy quiet for the two of them. In the evenings they sat at the table with a map of their days. It was not paper and ink, it was talk and breath. They sketched the morning of their wedding as if they were building a house of light, a small church, evergreen pinned to lamp-posts if spring was shy, windows open if spring was brave, the hymn that hummed in both their chests. He practiced holding her hand without owning it. She practiced leaning without erasing herself. They spoke about merging 2 shelves of books and 2 sets of stubborn habits. And they laughed over where to put the piano and which cupboard ought to hold the tea. And when the talk thinned to silence, they let silence thicken into peace. On a Tuesday that smelled faintly of wet dirt and new wood, Violet walked Frances's lane with a basket on her arm. The older woman had agreed to help her alter the bodice of a dress Violet had not thought she'd ever wear for anything that mattered. They sat together with pins and patient thread, and when Frances pricked her own finger, she did not curse. She lifted the bead of blood as if it were a ruby and said, "It's what it costs to fit a thing to a life." Violet looked down at the fabric and thought of all the ways she'd been refitted to herself since she'd come home. On Thursday, Elijah brought her mother's locket to the church and asked Reverend Parker if there was a way to stitch the past to the present, without making either seem small. The Reverend, who had married and buried and baptized more than he cared to count, nodded as if someone had finally asked a sensible question. "Wear it," he said simply, "and let it catch the light." By the end of April, the school edition stood framed against the sky, a clean skeleton waiting for summer flesh. The men paused their hammers when Violet and Elijah walked past, not out of deference, but because the eye loves a good story even when it knows the ending. Children lined up their lunch tins on the new sill and announced gravely that the extra room would hold both a telescope and a corner for secrets. Violet kissed the crown of a small head and held her hand just above the ring, not to hide it, but to feel its coolness against her skin the way a heartbeat feels against a wrist. The day before the wedding, Mrs. Wilkins insisted on fussing until the house itself felt powdered. Bread cooled in neat rows by the window. orange peels curled like prayer on the sill. "You can't sleep here," she said to Elijah in the tone of a general. "Superstition or not, I won't have it." He made a bed for himself in the office with a blanket and a stack of case notes. And if he read the same paragraph 5 times without memory of it, no one needed to know. Violet lay in the boarding-house room that had held both her trembling and her becoming, and watched moonlight pour itself in long strips across the floor. She did not write. She pressed the locket to her lips and whispered to the woman whose portrait watched from the tiny oval frame, "I'm going to be happy in the morning." And somewhere in the heart's quiet room, she heard a reply, "You already are." Spring made good on its promise. The church was simple and perfect, white paint bright as a smile. No bells rang. The cattle lowed, a wagon wheel squeaked, a robin started and stopped as if he were unsure how to hold so much blue. The women wore ribbons like pieces of sky. The men had shaved too closely, or not at all. Either way, they looked their best. Elijah stood at the front with his hands gentle at his sides and his mouth set in an effort not to grin like a fool. The effort failed when Violet walked in. She wore the altered dress and her mother's locket and the look of someone walking down a road she had walked in dreams until the dream taught the road to appear. The aisle was made by people who loved her, and she could feel it in her knees. She reached Elijah without tripping, which felt like a miracle, and placed her hands in his, which felt like an answer. Reverend Parker did not say more words than were necessary. He spoke of weathering, of the grain of wood, and the way patience brings out its beauty. He spoke of choosing daily bread and daily mercy. He spoke of how love remakes a house but leaves the door in the same place, so both people can still find their way in. When he asked them to speak, neither blinked. They had been speaking to each other for months, and the words they said aloud were only the part of the story the town needed to hear. "I will not leave when it is hardest," Violet said, voice steady as a hand on a fevered brow. "I will set another place at the table for grief when it knocks, and I will send it away with leftovers when joy arrives. I will hold your name the way a good land holds water." "I will make room," Elijah said, his voice a lantern lit from within. "Room for your light, room for your quiet, room for the days you need to be small and the days you need to take up the whole room. I will not mistake protection for control. I will build what I can, and I will learn to stand back and admire what you build." They exchanged rings in the old way. Hers shimmered like a small moon between silver leaves. His was a band the color of morning tannin, hammered by a friend who knew how to swing a life into shape. When Reverend Parker said the sentence that unfastened them from the past and fastened them to each other, "You may," Elijah leaned forward and kissed her with a care so deep it felt like a promise he had punched into the very earth. The town clapped and whooped and wiped their eyes. Frances pretended something had flown into hers and gave up the pretense immediately. They spilled out into the spring like flour on a board. There was cake cut with a clean knife and laughter that braided itself into new memory. There was a waltz on the grass and a reel on the boards, and when the fiddles slowed to a tune that everyone knew without knowing how, Elijah's hand found Violet's waist as if it had been built for that exact work. He did not spin her fast, though he could have. He matched his pace to her breath and the tilt of her smile and the place where her heart met her step. Around them, the town blurred into sound and color, lanterns rising in the afternoon like tame stars. As the sun leaned toward evening and the shadows lengthened across the hill, they left the noise gently, the way one leaves a good story to make a better one. At the White House, the door opened the way it had for the first time, willing, patient, pleased. Inside, Violet saw small changes she had not authorized and loved each one. A vase of lilacs on the piano, a folded blanket on the back of the settee, 2 cups side by side on the kitchen shelf. She touched the locket, then the ring, then the bare skin under her collarbone, as if to pin joy in place. Elijah stood in the doorway watching her as if observation were a skill to practice daily. "Welcome home," he said, and the words laid themselves down like a carpet from threshold to hearth. They did not rush the evening. They lit lamps and ate bread with butter and salt and called it a feast. They sat close and spoke low, and when they fell quiet, they listened to the house listening back. At some point, she moved to the piano and let her fingers find a hymn her mother had loved. The melody wore a new suit of notes in this room, and when she faltered, Elijah hummed the part he had always known without knowing why. She turned to him, and the look they shared did what music could not. It joined 2 histories into one language. Later, in the soft hush that comes after vows and cake and dancing, and the kind of laughter that leaves the ribs sore, Elijah drew the curtains but left them open a hand's width. "For the stars," he said. "They keep their promises better when they can see we are keeping ours." "You and your constellations," she teased, and then softened, "because a man who loves the map of the sky is a man who will remember the location of his wife's heart in the dark." She rested her head on his shoulder and breathed in the smell that belonged uniquely to him. Leather and pine and something warm like baked sugar. Peace did not come like a flood or a trumpet. It came like a quilt tugged up to the chin, like a hand finding another under a table. The house sighed around them. Outside, the creek went on saying what creeks say. Time is a kind of kindness when you let it be. Before sleep found her, Violet reached for the small book she had not touched for days, and wrote without lamp, the nib scraping lightly in the dark. Only a line, but it felt like the heart of a chapter. "I kept my promise to return. Today we gave the promise a house. Morning would bring the town's gentle rowdiness, plates to return, a schoolroom to sweep, a note from Mrs. Wilkins declaring triumph, a wink from the mayor, and children shouting Mrs. Montgomery, with a mix of astonishment and delight. It would bring talk of shelves and hospital rooms and a small garden out back for herbs and the sacred business of deciding where to put hooks for hanging everyday coats. It would bring the ordinary beauty they had chosen, bread rising, boots drying, pencils sharpening, grief knocking sometimes and being fed anyway, joy arriving in its own messy way, and being asked to stay. Night brought only this, the soft rhythm of a good man's breathing, a silver ring cooling slowly against a warm finger, spring leaning on the sill with its pockets full of seeds. Somewhere a robin tried the first notes of tomorrow. Violet smiled into the dark, sure as a tide. The path ahead was lined with work and weather, and days that would need double helpings of patience. She had both. And in the quiet between heartbeats, the story they had carried alone put down its bags and settled in. The oak stood outside, keeping watch. The creek kept speaking. The stars kept their shy, clear vigil. And as dawn began its slow climb toward the window, the life they would build turned its face toward the light, ready for its first true day. Spring melted fully into summer, and Silver Ridge awoke to a season of quiet renewal. The storms had passed, both in the sky and in the hearts of those who had endured them. The mountains stood gentle and green now, their edges softened by mist, their streams alive with light. Days lengthened, the air ripened with the scent of lilac and rain-warmed soil, and the town began to hum with a new rhythm, one stitched together by forgiveness, courage, and love that grew like wildflowers in the cracks of what had once been broken. The years unfolded like petals, slowly, tenderly, without hurry. Time, once an enemy that separated and scarred, became the quiet rhythm of a shared life. The house on the hill watched over Redemption Creek the way a lighthouse watches the sea, faithfully, without fanfare. It saw mornings of laughter and evenings of stillness, storms that tested the roof, summers that poured honey through the windows. And in every season, the same two hearts moved through the rooms together, Violet and Elijah Montgomery, teacher and sheriff, wife and husband, both mended and remade by the miracle of ordinary love. Their first spring was full of beginnings. The school expansion finished at last, its new windows catching the light like fresh eyes. Violet filled the shelves with books, gifts, donations, and volumes bought with her modest savings. Each one she opened carried a faint scent of paper and hope. The children adored the new space, racing in with dusty boots and leaving laughter in their wake. Elijah often stopped by during lessons under the excuse of checking security, though every soul in town knew it was to hear his wife's voice drift through the open windows. On those afternoons, Violet would glance up to see him leaning by the doorway, arms folded, that familiar smile playing beneath his stubble. The children greeted him like a hero, and he would ruffle hair and joke, and sometimes read a passage himself, his baritone steady as the hills. She loved watching him there, strong, gentle, his eyes always finding hers in a room full of chaos. It felt like belonging made visible, like grace made flesh. When dusk fell and the lanterns were lit, they would walk home through the quiet streets, the scent of wood smoke, the soft chorus of crickets, the slow rhythm of boots on dirt. All of it wove itself into the small miracle of contentment. At home, she would hang her shawl, and he would pour coffee into 2 chipped mugs. They spoke of simple things: the stubborn mare who refused to be shoed, the little girl who finally spelled her name right, the gossip that fluttered harmlessly around the bakery. Yet in each word lay a deeper current, the knowing of 2 lives that had chosen not merely to meet, but to grow together. The townspeople changed around them. The same children Violet taught became young adults with voices and opinions and dreams. The women of Redemption Creek began taking evening reading classes in the schoolroom, their laughter filling the night as they stumbled over long sentences and proud discoveries. It was Violet's idea, but Elijah built the benches himself, sanding each edge smooth so no one would snag their skirts. "Comfort matters," he told her one night, his hand resting over hers on the table. "You can't teach peace if the chair hurts." Peace, she'd learned, was built in small ways. A steady hand on a frightened shoulder, a patient word where anger used to live. Elijah's leadership changed the town more than any law ever had. He spoke softly, but acted swiftly, and he treated even wrongdoers with a fairness that unsettled those who thought justice meant vengeance. "Mercy isn't weakness," he often said. It's the work of remembering that people can become better. It wasn't long before the mayor, worn with age, asked Elijah to take his place. The election came quietly, without drama. The people simply nodded and said it was time. On the day he accepted, Violet stood at his side, her hand entwined with his. "Mayor Montgomery," she whispered with a smile that carried both pride and amusement, "you'll need to mind your handwriting. There'll be far more letters to sign." He chuckled and kissed her forehead. "Only if you promise to correct them." Their marriage was a tender conversation between two strong spirits. They had disagreements about where to plant the vegetables, about whether the school needed new desks or new books first, but never once did anger last through the night. Elijah had a habit of sitting quietly whenever tempers rose, waiting until silence softened the edges of his thoughts. Violet, who had once been quick to retreat into pride, learned to meet that silence halfway. They apologized easily, forgave even easier. Each argument ended the same way, one reaching for the other's hand. When Violet discovered she was carrying their first child, she waited 3 days before telling him. Not from fear, but from a private wish to keep the secret folded inside her heart a little longer, like a fragile song not yet ready to be sung. When she finally whispered the words, "By the fire, on a night filled with gentle rain," Elijah went still. Then his eyes shone in a way that made her laugh through tears. He knelt before her and rested his forehead against her belly, whispering words she couldn't quite hear, a prayer, a promise, a thank you. Those months became a hymn of anticipation. The townsfolk buzzed with excitement, every woman offering advice, every man pretending not to be invested and failing. Mrs. Wilkins knit blankets in every shade she could find. Francis Miller, who had once been the embodiment of bitterness, brought jars of preserves to "keep your strength up, dear." Violet's classroom filled with hand-drawn cards from her students, clumsy, endearing declarations of love. When the baby arrived on a snowy November night, the world seemed to pause. Elijah stayed through every contraction, his steady presence a bridge across pain. And when a cry finally split the silence, strong and sure, he looked at the child as if he'd never known light before. A girl, small and fierce, with his eyes and her mother's quiet mouth. They named her Elizabeth Rose, for both their mothers, and when the Reverend blessed her the next Sunday, even the hardest men in town wiped their eyes behind rough hands. Motherhood softened Violet in ways she hadn't expected. Her patience, already deep, grew infinite. Her laughter came more easily. Her voice took on the low, musical cadence of lullabies. She taught during the day and held her daughter at night, often falling asleep in the rocking chair while Elijah carried the baby back to her cradle. Their home smelled of wood smoke and milk, and the sweet exhaustion of love fully lived. As Elizabeth grew, she toddled through the schoolhouse, chalk in hand, declaring herself teacher's helper. The students adored her. Elijah adored them both. Life was full, but not crowded. They made room for silence, for small joys, a quiet cup of tea before dawn, a walk under stars when the world felt too loud. When Violet became pregnant again, 2 years later, it was Elijah who wept first. Their son, Thomas Harold Montgomery, arrived with his mother's eyes and an insatiable curiosity. He took apart clocks before he could read, and once, when asked what he wanted to be, he declared, "Like Papa, but with more horses." Elijah laughed so hard he nearly dropped him. Years rolled gently forward. 2 more children came, twins, Sarah and James, and the house became a chorus of laughter and footsteps. The town flourished. Under Elijah's guidance, Redemption Creek gained a small hospital, better roads, even a library built beside the school. Violet led the women's society that organized it, her vision of education growing beyond the classroom. She began hosting readings every Sunday afternoon, stories of courage, forgiveness, and faith. Sometimes she read her own journals, carefully chosen passages that spoke of loss and healing without naming names. People listened, wept quietly, and found their own buried wounds mending in her words. At night, when the children slept, Elijah would sit beside her on the porch, their hands twined as they watched the stars above the valley. The air smelled of lilacs and memory. "We've done well," he'd say softly. "We've been lucky." "Not luck," Violet would answer. Grace. Grace. How it lived in their laughter, in the dirt beneath Elijah's fingernails, in the steady rhythm of her heart when she held him close. Grace in the way the town that once whispered her name with pity now spoke it with gratitude. Grace in how she forgave her father's ghost and found peace even in what could not be changed. One summer evening, on their 10th anniversary, Elijah surprised her with a picnic by Willow Creek, the same place where he'd once confessed that he had never stopped waiting. The water shimmered under the sunset, the same soft gold as the ring she wore. He had packed her favorite apple pie and a bottle of wine from Denver, though he spilled half of it laughing too hard when the cork flew into the water. They sat barefoot in the grass, their laughter mingling with the rustle of the trees. "I thought happiness would be louder," Violet said after a while, her voice thoughtful. "It doesn't have to be loud to be real," Elijah replied. "It just has to stay." She looked at him then, this man who had walked through every season with her, who had loved her without demanding she forget who she'd been. His hair was touched with silver now, his hands rougher, but his eyes, those steady blue eyes, still carried the same light that had recognized her that first day on Main Street. "You stayed," she said softly. "I promised," he answered. "And promises are how love keeps breathing." Their children grew strong. Elizabeth became a teacher like her mother. Thomas apprenticed with the blacksmith. Sarah painted the hills in watercolors that caught the spirit of the land, and James could fix anything with his hands. The house expanded to hold them all, yet never lost its warmth. Every corner told a story, every piece of wood, every scar on the floor, every photograph on the wall whispered of a love that had rebuilt not just 2 lives, but an entire town's belief in goodness. And when Violet stood on the porch in her middle years, watching Elijah teach their grandchildren to fish by the creek, she thought of how far they'd come. The girl who had once fled in shame had returned to build a sanctuary of her own making. The man who had been wronged had chosen compassion over bitterness. Together they had turned pain into something that could feed others, like bread baked from old grain, nourishing and new. The townsfolk often said the Montgomerys' love had healed Redemption Creek itself. Maybe they were right. The saloon grew quieter, the laughter grew kinder, and the people, those simple, earnest, flawed people, learned to believe again in second chances. The same streets that had once whispered her name with judgment now called her Mrs. Montgomery with warmth. And sometimes when Violet walked to church with Elijah's hand resting gently over hers, she felt the ghosts of the past fade behind her, not erased, but redeemed. On the evening of their 20th wedding anniversary, the whole town gathered in the square. Lanterns hung from the oak where Elijah had once proposed. The children sang, the mayor spoke, and someone placed a crown of white roses in Violet's hair. Elijah stood before her, his voice still strong but laced with time. "I'd know you anywhere," he said quietly, the same words he'd spoken that first day. She smiled, tears bright as stars. "Even if I changed everything about myself?" He shook his head. "You could change the world, Violet Rose, and I'd still find you." As the music rose and they began to dance under the lights, she rested her head against his shoulder. Around them, the people of Redemption Creek clapped in time. The air was full of warmth, laughter, forgiveness, and love so steady it felt eternal. Years later, when both their hair had turned to silver and the house echoed with grandchildren's voices, Violet still kept her journal. On its last page, written in a hand slower but still sure, were the words, "Love doesn't end. It deepens. It learns our silence and forgives our flaws. It waits at the gate when we are late and holds us steady when we are tired. Elijah found me once when I was lost, and since then, every day, he has found me again, in the morning light, in the laughter of our children, in the quiet of forgiveness. If heaven feels like home, it must sound like his voice saying my name." Outside, the oak stood tall, its roots deep in the same soil that had once held their fears. The creek whispered to the stars. The house on the hill, white and timeless, glowed softly in the lamplight, carrying the echoes of a love that had healed not only two hearts, but everyone who had witnessed it. And if you've come this far with them, if you've ever believed that love can find its way back through time, through mistakes, through every closed door, then you already carry a piece of their story inside you. Let it remind you that no wound is too deep to heal, no past too heavy to forgive, no heart too lost to be found again. If this story touched your soul, leave a piece of your heart behind. Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more tales of love, healing, and second chances. Because somewhere, someone is still waiting to be found, and every story, just like every heart, deserves a little light.